May 23, 1943, Camp Ruston, Louisiana. The aroma of fresh-baked bread drifted across the compound on a warm southern breeze, carrying with it an olfactory promise that seemed almost cruelly impossible to Soldato Giuseppe Romano, who stood behind the wire fence watching American soldiers unload crates from a supply truck. The scent was so vivid, so achingly real after months of subsisting on hardtack and watery soup in North African prison camps, that Romano wondered if his hunger had finally induced hallucinations. But then the mess sergeant emerged from the kitchen barracks carrying a tray stacked with actual loaves, golden-crusted, still steaming, more bread than Romano had seen in a single place since before the war began 3 years earlier. The sound that accompanied this vision was equally surreal. American guards laughing with one another, their voices carrying none of the harsh edge that Romano had been conditioned to expect from captors. No shouting or threats, just the easy camaraderie of men performing routine duties in a place where violence was aberration rather than norm. Romano pressed his face closer to the fence, feeling the wire's diamond pattern indent his cheek, breathing deeply to capture every molecule of that bread scent, while his mind struggled to reconcile expectation with reality. He had surrendered to British forces in Tunisia 6 weeks earlier, part of the mass capitulation that ended the North African campaign, and delivered over 275,000 Axis soldiers into Allied captivity. The propaganda he had absorbed through 2 years of fascist military service had prepared him for brutality. Stories of prisoners worked to death, of starvation rations, of casual violence from guards who viewed captives as subhuman. The British camps had been adequate if austere, providing survival without comfort. But transfer to American custody had brought whispered rumors among the prisoners that seemed too fantastical to believe. That Americans fed prisoners almost as well as their own troops. That camps operated according to Geneva Convention standards that treated prisoners as human beings deserving dignity. That the New World's abundance extended even to defeated enemies. The bread being unloaded from that supply truck represented more than sustenance. It was evidence, material and undeniable, that challenged every assumption Romano had held about his captors and about the war itself. In fascist Italy, bread had been rationed since 1940, with quality declining steadily as wheat supplies diminished and adulterants were mixed into flour to stretch limited stocks. Romano's family in Naples received perhaps 200 grams daily, when distributions occurred at all. Dark bread made from grain mixed with chestnuts or beans, sometimes with sawdust when even substitutes ran short. Yet here in Louisiana, in a camp housing enemy soldiers, bread arrived in quantities that suggested abundance rather than scarcity, quality that suggested priorities beyond mere survival. Each loaf announced that America possessed agricultural and industrial capacity, so vast that even prisoners could be fed generously, that the United States operated from fundamentally different economic foundations than the Axis powers struggling to sustain their war efforts through requisition and rationing. This moment, an Italian prisoner encountering American material abundance through the simple medium of fresh bread represented a cognitive rupture that would transform Romano's understanding of the war, of ideology, and ultimately of what political and economic systems could achieve when organizing society. For Italian soldiers who had fought for fascism's promises of empire and glory, who had been told that democratic capitalism was decadent and destined for defeat, direct experience of American prisoner of war camps became an involuntary education in the practical differences between totalitarian scarcity and democratic abundance, between societies that demanded sacrifice without providing sustenance and societies whose prosperity extended even to defeated enemies. To understand the magnitude of this transformation, one must first comprehend the conditions Italian soldiers had endured before capture and the propaganda framework that had shaped their expectations. Italy entered World War II in June 1940, with an economy already strained by years of military adventures in Ethiopia and Spain, with an industrial base inadequate for modern warfare, and with agricultural production insufficient to feed its population without imports that Allied naval power increasingly interdicted. Italian soldiers fought on rations that were meager even by contemporary standards, often less than 2,000 calories daily, heavy on bread and pasta when available but chronically short of protein, fats, and fresh vegetables. Medical examinations of Italian troops revealed widespread malnutrition, with soldiers losing dangerous amounts of weight during campaigns and suffering from deficiency diseases that undermined combat effectiveness. Romano had experienced this deprivation directly during his service in North Africa, where Italian supply lines stretched across the Mediterranean under constant Allied naval and air attack. Rations arrived irregularly and in quantities insufficient for adequate nutrition, forcing soldiers to supplement official supplies by bartering with local populations or simply going hungry. Fresh bread became a luxury, replaced by hardtack or dried biscuits that were barely edible even when soaked in water or coffee. Meat was rarely available, vegetables were scarce, and the monotony of inadequate rations ground down morale as effectively as combat losses did. Romano had grown accustomed to constant hunger, to the obsessive food-centered conversations that dominated every rest period, to the physical weakness that made routine tasks exhausting, and combat operations nearly impossible to sustain. Fascist propaganda had attempted to frame this privation as virtuous sacrifice, as evidence of Italian martial spirit that could endure hardship soft democracies could never tolerate. Soldiers were told that Americans were weak and undisciplined, that their material abundance had made them incapable of the sacrifices required for military success, that Italian determination would ultimately triumph over American wealth, because spirit mattered more than materialism. This narrative allowed soldiers to endure deprivation by converting it into evidence of superiority, by suggesting that hardship they suffered was building character and strength that would prove decisive when confronted with pampered enemies unused to discomfort. The propaganda had also prepared Italian soldiers for harsh treatment if captured, emphasizing that democracy's supposed respect for human rights was hypocrisy that would be abandoned when dealing with fascist enemies. Stories circulated about prisoners being worked to death, about starvation in camps, about violence from guards who viewed Italians with contempt. These warnings were designed to discourage surrender, to make soldiers fight harder rather than accept capture, but they also created expectations that made the reality of American camps all the more shocking when experience contradicted propaganda predictions. Romano's transfer to Camp Ruston had occurred through the systematic processing that characterized American handling of the massive prisoner influx from North Africa. After initial capture by British forces, Italian prisoners had been concentrated in holding camps in Tunisia, where they received basic medical screening, documentation, and preliminary classification. Those selected for transfer to the United States primarily enlisted men and junior officers deemed unlikely to be war criminals or security threats had been shipped across the Atlantic in converted cargo vessels that maintained Geneva Convention standards for prisoner transport. The voyage had been Romano's first extended exposure to American logistics and organizational capacity, as prisoners received regular meals, adequate sanitation, and medical care during the crossing, treatment that stood in stark contrast to the chaos and neglect that had characterized Italian military logistics even before battlefield reverses began. Arrival in the United States had provided Romano with his first visual evidence of American industrial might: the port, facilities at Norfolk, Virginia, where his ship docked, the rail infrastructure that transported prisoners westward to inland camps, the seemingly endless landscape of farms and factories visible through the train car windows. But it was arrival at Camp Ruston and the beginning of life as a prisoner of war that truly began his education in what American society and economy could achieve when fully mobilized. The camp itself communicated messages about American institutional capacity and values simply through its physical infrastructure and operating procedures. Camp Ruston occupied several hundred acres of Louisiana farmland, housing approximately 4,000 Italian prisoners in purpose-built barracks that provided adequate shelter from weather, with heating for winter and screening for summer. The camp had been constructed rapidly as part of the massive American prisoner of war camp network that would eventually house over 425,000 Axis prisoners across the United States, a logistical achievement that required diverting resources from other uses, but that American capacity made feasible. The barracks were not luxurious, but they were functional and maintained to standards that exceeded what many prisoners had experienced in their own military service. Solid construction, adequate ventilation, sufficient space to avoid the dangerous overcrowding that bred disease. But it was the food, That bread whose aroma had first captured Romano's attention, that became the tangible, daily manifestation of American abundance and the symbolic center around which his transformation of consciousness would revolve. The first meal served to prisoners at Camp Ruston shattered Romano's expectations so completely that he initially suspected some form of elaborate deception. Breakfast included eggs, bacon, bread with butter and jam, coffee with sugar and milk, and portions that were not merely adequate but generous by any standard Romano knew. The quality was not gourmet, but it was wholesome and well prepared, served hot from kitchens that operated according to sanitation standards enforced by military inspections, provided in quantities that left prisoners feeling genuinely satisfied rather than merely slightly less hungry than before. This pattern continued through subsequent meals, with lunch and dinner providing similar abundance: meat, vegetables, bread, dessert, coffee. The menu varied, but the generosity remained consistent, with total daily caloric intake exceeding 3,000 calories, higher than what Italian civilians received at home, and approaching what American soldiers themselves were allocated. Romano found himself eating until full for the first time in years, his body slowly recovering from the accumulated deficit of chronic undernutrition, his physical strength gradually returning as adequate nutrition enabled recovery from the physiological damage that prolonged deprivation had inflicted. The bread appeared at every meal. Stacks of white bread sliced and arranged on tables where prisoners could take as much as they wanted. This casual abundance, bread without rationing, without careful portioning, without the complex economic calculations that governed every bite of food in Italy, represented a form of wealth that Romano struggled to process within his existing conceptual frameworks. The bread was made from wheat flour without adulterants, was fresh rather than stale, and was available in quantities that made the very concept of bread shortage seem like a nightmare from which he was slowly awakening. Each slice communicated that America possessed agricultural capacity and industrial organization capable of producing food at scales that made rationing unnecessary even during wartime, that the economic system generating this abundance functioned according to principles fundamentally different from the command economy that had left Italy chronically short of basics, necessities. Romano's initial response to this abundance mixed disbelief, suspicion, and a dawning recognition that he had been systematically lied to about the enemy he had been fighting. Conversations with fellow prisoners revealed that his experience was universal. All were shocked by the food quality and quantity. All had expected harsh treatment that had not materialized, and all struggled to reconcile their direct observations with the propaganda narratives they had internalized. Some prisoners remained convinced that the good treatment was temporary or deceptive, that real conditions would be revealed once American authorities determined that generosity had not extracted the intelligence or compliance they sought. But as days became weeks and the bread kept appearing at every meal, as the pattern of adequate treatment persisted through routine camp operations, skepticism gradually gave way to acceptance that this was not deception, but rather the normal functioning of American institutional culture and economic capacity. The freedom that prisoners experienced at Camp Ruston, while obviously constrained by their status as prisoners of war, nevertheless exceeded anything Romano had anticipated. The camp operated under regulations that treated prisoners as human beings deserving dignity, rather than as criminals deserving punishment. Prisoners had access to recreational facilities, including sports fields where they could play soccer, a library with Italian-language books and newspapers, censored but substantive, and canteens where they could purchase small luxuries using scrip earned through work programs. Religious services were conducted by Italian chaplains who had been captured with combat units, allowing prisoners to maintain spiritual practices without interference or persecution. Educational programs provided opportunities to learn English, to acquire vocational skills, and to engage with ideas and information that fascist censorship had suppressed. This relative freedom was not unlimited. Prisoners remained under guard, movement was restricted, and security protocols governed daily routines. But within these boundaries, American administrators treated prisoners as individuals capable of self-organization and deserving respect, rather than as masses requiring constant coercion and surveillance. Prisoners elected representatives to communicate concerns to camp authorities, participated in organizing recreational and cultural activities, and generally experienced a degree of autonomy that contrasted sharply with the authoritarian military culture they had known in Italian service. The trust that American authorities demonstrated, allowing prisoners considerable self-governance, providing them with tools and equipment for work and recreation, permitting them to maintain cultural identity and practice communicated assumptions about human nature and social organization fundamentally different from fascist ideology's insistence on hierarchy and coercion. The work programs that employed prisoner labor provided Romano with additional insights into American economic organization and values. Under Geneva Convention provisions, enlisted prisoners could be required to work in non-military capacities, and Camp Ruston organized labor details that sent prisoners to surrounding farms and businesses to address wartime labor shortages. Romano found himself assigned to agricultural work on Louisiana cotton and soybean farms, where he experienced American mechanized agriculture firsthand and received wages in scrip for his labor that could be used to purchase items in camp canteens. The work itself was hard but not brutal, conducted under conditions that respected worker safety and provided adequate breaks and facilities. American farmers who employed prisoner labor treated them with pragmatic courtesy, seeing them as necessary workers rather than as enemies deserving abuse. Romano observed the mechanization of American agriculture, the tractors, combines, and equipment that made American farms far more productive than Italian equivalents where animal and human power still dominated. The scale of individual farms astonished him. Holdings of hundreds or thousands of acres worked by small crews with machinery, producing yields that exceeded what much larger Italian farming populations achieved through more labor-intensive methods. The agricultural abundance visible in Louisiana's farms helped explain where the bread came from, how America could feed both its civilian population and its military while still providing generous rations to prisoners. The agricultural base was so productive that food scarcity was never a constraint on American warfighting capacity. The wages prisoners received, while modest, represented another dimension of American values that contrasted with fascist practice. Geneva Conventions required that prisoners performing labor be compensated, but American implementation of this requirement treated compensation seriously rather than as pro forma compliance. The scrip prisoners earned could purchase items in camp canteens, toiletries, snacks, cigarettes, small luxuries, providing prisoners with agency and choice rather than treating them as purely passive recipients of whatever authorities decided to provide. This economic participation, limited as it was, reflected broader American cultural assumptions about individual autonomy and the benefits of market mechanisms even in contexts where administrative provision might have been simpler to implement. As months passed and Romano adjusted to camp routines, the transformation in his political consciousness accelerated through accumulation of evidence that challenged fascist ideology's fundamental claims. The bread that appeared daily became a symbol connecting immediate experience to broader recognition of systemic differences between the societies at war. Each slice testified to productive capacity that fascist Italy had never achieved despite its imperial ambitions and its claims about totalitarian efficiency. The bread announced that democratic capitalism, whatever its theoretical contradictions or moral failings, could organize resources and generate abundance at scales that fascist corporatism could not match despite advantages of centralized control and ideological unity. Romano's conversations with American guards and camp personnel, facilitated through improving English skills and through Italian Americans who served as translators, provided additional challenges to his ideological assumptions. The Americans he encountered were not the decadent weaklings of propaganda, but generally decent people performing difficult jobs with professional competence, individuals representing a cross-section of American society, rather than a militaristic elite. They spoke about politics with casual criticism of their own government that would have been dangerous in fascist Italy, complained about military service in ways that suggested they viewed it as temporary obligation rather than as sacred duty, and demonstrated individualism that contradicted propaganda claims about American conformity and moral weakness. News of Italy's situation reached the camp through official channels and through letters that prisoners could send and receive through International Red Cross mail services. Romano learned through these communications that Italy's position had deteriorated catastrophically since his capture. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943, Mussolini's fall from power, Italy's surrender to the Allies in September, and the German occupation of northern Italy that followed. The letters from his family described conditions that made his own circumstances seem privileged by comparison. Naples under Allied occupation suffering from bombing damage and food shortages, his family surviving on rations that barely prevented starvation, the chaos and violence that accompanied Italy's transformation from Axis partner to occupied territory. The contrast between Romano's relative comfort in Louisiana and his family's suffering in Naples created complex emotions: guilt about his own security while loved ones endured hardship, anger at the fascist regime that had led Italy into disastrous war, and recognition that the bread he ate daily in captivity exceeded what his family could obtain at home, despite Italy supposedly being liberated. This contrast drove home the lesson about relative productive capacity and economic organization. America could afford to feed prisoners generously, while Italy could barely feed its own civilians, a disparity that revealed fundamental differences in economic systems and societal organization. The bread Romano ate became invested with symbolic weight that transcended its material substance. Each slice represented the agricultural productivity that American farming achieved through mechanization and systematic agronomy, the industrial capacity that could mill flour at scales that made refined products routinely available, the logistics networks that distributed food from farms through mills to military kitchens, serving camps across the continental United States, and the institutional culture that treated adequate provisioning as non-negotiable standard, rather than as aspiration to be pursued when resources permitted. The bread was capitalism made tangible, democracy rendered edible, the material manifestation of prosperity that free societies could generate when organizing resources through market mechanisms and republican institutions. The transformation in Romano's consciousness from fascist believer to skeptic of authoritarianism occurred through this daily confrontation with evidence that challenged propaganda narratives. The process was neither instant nor simple. Ideological frameworks are resistant to change even when confronted with contradictory evidence, and Romano struggled with cognitive dissonance as his direct experience diverged from beliefs he had held and fought for. But the bread kept appearing, the adequate treatment continued, and the accumulation of evidence eventually overwhelmed the propaganda framework's ability to explain away observable reality. By early 1944, Romano had largely abandoned belief in fascist ideology and in the justness of the cause he had served. The transformation was partly intellectual, recognition that propaganda had systematically misrepresented American society, and that the war had been launched based on false assumptions about enemy weakness. But it was also visceral and emotional, grounded in the daily experience of being treated with more dignity as a prisoner than he had been treated as a soldier in Italian service, of eating better in captivity than he had eaten while fighting for his own nation, and of witnessing organizational competence and material abundance that made fascist claims about totalitarian superiority seem laughable in retrospect. At the camp experience continued evolving as the war progressed and Italy's status shifted from enemy to ambiguous co-belligerent. After the September 1943 surrender, Italian prisoners could request to join Italian co-belligerent units fighting alongside the Allies, and some prisoners made this choice, motivated by complex mixtures of anti-fascism, desire to fight Germans who now occupied their homeland, and practical calculation about improving their status. Romano chose to remain in camp, reluctant to rejoin military service even in a different cause, but he followed with interest the political debates among prisoners about Italy's future and what form of government should emerge after fascism's defeat. These political discussions occurred openly in ways that would have been impossible in fascist Italy, where dissent was dangerous and alternative political views were suppressed. The relative freedom of the camp environment, where American authorities permitted prisoners considerable latitude in their internal affairs, provided security was maintained, allowed Italian prisoners to debate political ideas, to organize along different ideological lines, and to prepare for eventual return to an Italy that would need to be reconstructed on different principles. Romano participated in these discussions, drawn toward democratic and socialist arguments that emphasized political freedom, economic justice, and rejection of both fascism and its authoritarian alternatives. The bread continued appearing at meals throughout 1944 and into 1945, its daily presence becoming so routine that Romano sometimes forgot to consciously register its significance. But the symbolism remained potent, particularly when he received letters from Naples describing his family's continued food shortages despite Allied occupation and relief efforts. The disparity between his own adequate nutrition and his family's hunger created ongoing tension, but it also reinforced the lesson about American productive capacity. Even in Italy, liberated by American forces, food remained scarce because the agricultural and economic infrastructure had been damaged by years of war and mismanagement, while in America, food abundance persisted, despite global conflict and massive military mobilization. Germany's surrender in May 1945 and Japan's surrender in August marked the war's end and initiated the process of prisoner repatriation. For Italian prisoners, repatriation was complicated by Italy's political status and by the devastation that made immediate return problematic. Many prisoners remained in American camps through late 1945 and into 1946, working in agricultural and industrial jobs that addressed American labor shortages, while European infrastructure was rebuilt sufficiently to receive returning prisoners. Romano worked Louisiana farms through the 1945 growing season, sending wages home to support his family while awaiting repatriation authorization. The final months in camp were bittersweet. Romano had adapted to routines that, while constraining, had provided security and adequate material conditions that he knew awaited him at home would not match. The bread at meals took on additional significance as symbol of what he was leaving behind, representing abundance and stability that post-war Italy would struggle to achieve for years. When repatriation orders finally arrived in January 1946, Romano's dominant emotion was not joy about going home but anxiety about returning to a nation whose prospects seemed bleak compared to the American prosperity he had witnessed even in prisoner of war camp. The return to Naples fulfilled Romano's anxieties. The city was devastated by bombing and battle damage. Infrastructure was barely functional. Food remained scarce with rationing continuing under Allied military government, and the political situation was chaotic as various factions competed to shape post-war Italy. Romano's family survived but had suffered years of privation that showed in their gaunt faces and worn clothing. The contrast with his own relatively healthy appearance, maintained through adequate nutrition in American captivity, was visible and troubling. He had been better cared for as a prisoner than his family had been as civilians in their own nation. Romano's political activities in post-war Italy were influenced by his prisoner of war experience and the lessons it had taught about economic systems and political organization. He joined political movements advocating for democratic governance and market-oriented economic policies, arguing from direct observation that democratic capitalism could produce prosperity that fascist corporatism had only promised. His testimony about American prisoner camps shared with family and community contributed to broader Italian reassessment of fascism and to growing support for democratic institutions and Western alignment. In the emerging Cold War context, the bread he had eaten in Campo Rustin became a touchstone in these political discussions, a symbol Romano invoked when arguing that American-style democracy and capitalism could produce abundance rather than merely managing scarcity, that political freedom was compatible with economic prosperity, and that Italy's future should be built on principles of liberty and market economics rather than on authoritarian alternatives, whether fascist or communist. His arguments drew credibility from direct experience. He had lived in both systems, had seen firsthand the material conditions they produced, and could testify to which had actually delivered on promises about providing for citizens' welfare. As years passed and Italy rebuilt under Marshall Plan assistance and democratic governance, as Italian economic miracle of the 1950s and 1960s generated prosperity that exceeded pre-war levels, Romano saw vindication of the lessons he had learned in American captivity. The bread that appeared in Italian bakeries and homes in increasing abundance through the post-war decades confirmed that the economic principles visible in American prisoner camps, market efficiency, productivity incentives, institutional competence, could be adapted to Italian conditions and produce similar results when freed from fascist ideologies, distortions, and constraints. The symbolic bread, from Camp Rustin, echoed through Romano's memory as reminder of transformation that had begun with olfactory experience in Louisiana heat. The scent of fresh-baked bread had been the first sensory evidence that challenged propaganda narratives. The initial crack in ideological certainty that would eventually shatter through accumulated observation of how democratic societies organize themselves and what such organization could achieve in material terms. The bread had been more than food. It was a daily lesson in political economy, a tangible argument for democratic capitalism's advantages over authoritarian alternatives, and evidence that societies organizing themselves according to principles of freedom and market competition could generate abundance that centralized command could only envy. In the epilogue of his life, Romano looked back on his prisoner of war experience not as time lost or suffering endured, but as involuntary education that had liberated him from ideological delusion and prepared him for productive participation in Italy's democratic reconstruction. The camps Americans called necessary logistics, housing enemy prisoners until war ended and repatriation could proceed safely, had been for Romano and countless Italian prisoners a portal to understanding different possibilities for political and economic organization, a demonstration that abundance and freedom were not contradictory but complementary, and that societies built on democratic principles could achieve prosperity that totalitarian alternatives promised but never delivered. The bread served in Camp Rustin, that simple carbohydrate sustenance that Americans provided with casual generosity to defeated enemies, had communicated truths about power, prosperity, and the practical advantages of organizing society around human dignity and individual liberty, rather than around ideological conformity and collective sacrifice. Romano had entered American captivity as a fascist soldier, expecting harsh treatment from decadent enemies. He emerged as a democratic believer who had witnessed with his own eyes and tasted with his own tongue the material evidence that freedom and abundance reinforced rather than contradicted each other, that the choice between liberty and prosperity was a false dilemma, promoted by authoritarians to justify their power, and that the future belonged to societies that recognized these truths and organized themselves accordingly. The aroma of bread drifting across a Louisiana prison camp in 1943 had been the scent of possibility, the olfactory herald of personal and political transformation that would ripple through one prisoner's life and through the millions of others whose war experiences taught them that the world could be organized differently than the propaganda that led them into combat had claimed, that abundance was achievable through freedom rather than requiring sacrifice of freedom, and that the paradise prisoners called American camps was not exception or illusion, but a glimpse of what societies could achieve when choosing democracy over dictatorship, markets over mandates, and human dignity over ideological purity. The bread had been delicious, but the lesson it carried was sweeter still.